Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Help Me Believe, the show about Christian apologetics and theology. My name is Haden Clark, your host, and I'm excited to introduce my special guest to you. His name is John Gleason, also known as Godless Engineer. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing pretty good. I've, not been in quarantine, but I've, been on telework, so been at home a lot.
Yeah. I think a lot of people out there can relate to that. Maybe a little bit of cabin fever going on, or how are you feeling?
No, I mean, I get out and I walk around and stuff with my wife, so not too bad of cabin fever. But I also kind of like being at home in the first place, so it kind of works out a little bit.
Yeah, same here. I definitely enjoyed being at home. So you and I became acquainted via YouTube, and you made a response video to one of my videos, and then I made a response video to that. I believe you made another one, and you got another one in the works as well, so that's all perfectly well and fine, of course. But that's kind of how we became acquainted for the listener. And of course, if you want to catch up on that exchange to the listener, you can either go back on my channel and find the video I did, and of course I linked to John's videos as well, or I'm going to leave a link in the description to John's channel, which is called Godless Engineer, that you can follow that link and go catch up on that if you're interested, of course. We'll probably touch base on some of the stuff we've already talked about in the course of this interview, but anyway, that's kind of how we became acquainted with each other. But I don't know you all that well, and I'm sure there's plenty at least in my audience, who may or may not, so I thought it might be helpful if you gave a brief introduction of yourself.
Okay. Well, I'm Godless Engineer. I live in North Alabama, and I became an atheist when I was about 24, 25, something like that. So, I mean, it's been about 15, maybe, no, 10, not 15, 10, about 10 years or so. Yeah. Because I'm 35. I'm doing quick age math in my head.
Yeah, sometimes we don't like to admit it. Yeah.
So I've been an atheist about 10 years or so, and that's pretty much me.
Yeah. How'd you get started with the channel?
Well, so I have a page on Facebook, and it got kind of popular, and so I felt like the next step is to start doing videos like I see all the other atheist oriented or in the vertical of religion on YouTube. I saw other people doing it, and I was just like, I mean, I can do that.
Yeah.
And so I started doing it, and it just kind of been a gradual process ever since. I created a channel, and I started putting out videos, and I started, refining how I did my videos, the topics I covered and everything, and really researching on the best way to build a brand and all that. And now I'm here.
Yeah, I think you've done a really good job, by the way. Of course, we have disagreements on the material, obviously, but the structure and, like you said, the brand building and stuff, I kind of think like that as well. And so I kind of noticed those things when I was looking at your channel, and I think you've done an excellent job. And it obviously shows with the number of followers and engagement that you get. So congrats on all that success that you've had, by the way. And like I said, I think you're doing a good job in that area. Tell me, so you became a Christian. You became an atheist, you said. I guess that means that you were once a Christian. If so, tell me how you became a Christian and kind of what your experience as a Christian was like.
Okay. Well, I mean, I was born into it, basically. When I was born, I don't really consider myself any one particular religion, but I was soon put into church, and we were Catholic at the time, so we went to Catholic Mass every Sunday. We did a lot of things with the Catholic Church. I even went to private Catholic school until fourth grade. After fourth grade, I switched to public school. And a little bit after that, we left the Catholic Church and we went to basically Protestant denominations. I know my mom eventually ended up in a Lutheran church. I kind of bounced around some Baptist churches, some non-denominational churches. I always, as a kid, was really trying to be a good Christian, and go to church and pray and all that kind of stuff. And I really didn't feel all that connected to it, and I honestly just didn't even realized that not believing in God was, a possibility. And so when I was confronted by a friend after a church softball game about, believing in the Bible and how you had to 100% believe in the Bible from cover to cover, including like everything in Genesis being literal history and all of that, I had to really take a hard look at what I actually believed in and what I actually accepted, like either about the Bible or about my beliefs in general. And basically, it wasn't like a light switch kind of thing at first. It was a process. Like I read, new material to me about, the possibility of God not existing, and responses to arguments for the existence of God. I started looking into all of that, and I increasingly found myself siding with the side that was like, well, we're not sure if God exists or not. We don't know, and we don't believe that one exists. So I found myself drawn to that particular position because I felt like it was a more tenable position to have. And, throughout the course of me figuring out what I believed, I eventually came to the decision that I just simply didn't believe in a God anymore. And that was probably the biggest hurdle for me, was accepting the fact that I didn't believe in a God. And being in the South, I'm not exactly sure where you're located.
Yeah,
but
North Texas. North Texas. Yeah.
North Texas. Being in North Alabama, we're pretty heavily religious in this area, and there's not a lot of people in this area that are atheist. So that was the biggest hurdle for me. And, eventually it got to the point where I, was espousing my new worldview, talking about it like online, and it really angered some family members, and that's where I started the Godless Engineer channel.
Yeah.
Page and channel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And thanks for sharing that, by the way. That is enlightening to hear, and I think it's pretty common. It was a common experience for me, actually. And so when I say it's a common experience, I don't mean to belittle it or anything like that, but I just mean I hear that a lot and have felt it myself, which is, not, like you said, just not even being aware of the fact that there's people that don't believe in God. That when you said that, I was like, I've definitely felt that, and definitely hear that from some people as well. Like you said, we're in pretty similar contexts in the South, the Bible Belt, however you want to say it. And so it's just interesting to hear your story, because it kind of relates to mine, which was, I was like, wow, there's people that don't believe in God. What is that like? And I started reading Dawkins, and I started reading Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and things like that nature. And I even came to, this all happened while I was in seminary. And then I came to the point where one of my best friends, and I really mean he's like my best friend, is an atheist. And I went to him and said, I don't think I believe anymore. But then, like you were saying, one of those thoughts that entered my head was, it's going to be hard to do, if I'm going to accept this, because my family is this way. I wasn't married at the time, but now my wife is a Christian and things like that. It would be a difficult decision to make. And I'm by no means going to pretend like those things were not a factor for me. But anyway, it's just interesting to hear your story. Did you have anything else you want to say on that before we move on to the next question? Or?
No, other than I didn't really take the decision lightly. I don't think I really portrayed it as I took it lightly, but just anybody out there that could possibly be questioning their faith or anything like that's watching this,
sure.
I would say that just carefully consider it. And for me personally, I don't care which side of the question or the situation that you come out on, whether or not you believe in God or not, just as long as you have carefully considered your position and have come to your position because that is what you are convinced of, and not let somebody else try to tell you what to think. It's a big thing for me, is advocating for people to just consider it for themselves, regardless of which side you come out on.
Yeah, and I appreciate the way you just approached that, and I'll echo that 100%. You should definitely take it seriously, or take seriously the idea that you might be wrong, and whichever side you're on, and weigh the evidence for yourself. That was the biggest thing for me that initially almost led to me walking out of Christianity, was I just been taking this all on either blind faith or what somebody else has said. I haven't looked into this for myself, and so I'll definitely echo what you just said for sure. So what, you said it was a gradual process. What, and that you had talked to one of your friends who I think you said who was asking you questions about taking the Bible literally and things like that. What would you say was maybe like the first domino or something that started that whole process of questioning things, or that process of doubt? What was kind of the first thing that might have clicked, if there was one?
Well, so my friend that prompted that, he was pretty big into his church and his faith and all that. He had once been, I guess the best way to put it is rebellious in his like high school time.
Sure.
He was one of the guys that walked around with black fingernail polish on, and like everybody made fun of him and everything, and he kind of wore it proudly. And I was his. I wasn't like that, but I was his friend.
Don't lie to me. No, I'm just kidding.
I've never worn fingernail polish. I'll admit I get mani-pedis now,
nice.
But I do not get fingernail polish or toenail polish. But I'm sure I'm just wearing thin on that. But back then, like, I always gravitated towards people that were kind of the outcasts.
Sure.
I never really fit in with the more popular crowd because of either because of how smart I was in school, or because of how I looked, the fact that I was a little chubby. In any case, I was never part of like the in crowd or anything. So I always gravitated towards that, group of people. And he came around to religion. He found Jesus. He became saved again, and he really got into his faith. And I had been friends with him, and even though I wasn't as into faith as he was, he was still a really good friend. And when I started asking more questions about it, when I started thinking more about my beliefs and believing in God and really trying to go to church, be a good Christian and all that, because I thought that's what I needed to do, I started talking to him about it. And it just happened the one night when, I was kind of having doubts, or I was thinking about it or whatnot. He poses that to me. And, after he said that, I'm like, well, I can't take the Bible literally as it's written down. Like Genesis, how it talks about the universe being formed, that's just not how it happened. The Noah's Ark thing, that is really ridiculous to me. I don't think that actually happened, which I did at one point in time in my life. I remember as a kid, I was at my dad's house, and I was bored one day, and I thought about how, whoa, we're all related because of Adam and Eve, so it's like we're all family and stuff like that. So I remember as a kid like thinking about that stuff, but not critically thinking about it. So when I started critically thinking about it, really it was just the idea that you had to take a very fundamentalist and literal view of the Bible. I would say that was kind of the first domino, and that kind of set me down a path of trying to figure out where I landed, in my beliefs and what I actually believe, like critically think about it, and not just because that's what I think that it's supposed to, like, that's what I'm supposed to believe. I'm supposed to believe in God and all that. So, I just sort of started critically thinking about it, and that would be the first domino.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, you talk about you can't take the Genesis story and things like that literally. I think that's something that most people who grew up in the same kind of contexts that we did, and of course you and I don't have a perfectly parallel context that we grew up in, obviously, but just from what you're describing, it sounds very similar to my own, and so that's all I'm saying. But where I grew up thinking or believing, because that's what I was taught, that all of this is literally true in the most literal historical scientific sense and things like that. And whenever I first became interested in Christian apologetics, that's kind of the area that I gravitated towards. Those more like Ken Ham. I'm told that Kent Hovind is pretty similar. I didn't even know who that was until like a few weeks ago, but more like Ken Ham was kind of somebody that I really wanted to study or listen to and kind of be like whenever I first learned about Christian apologetics. But I don't feel that way any longer. And that's just because, like you said, the farther you go into things, it seems more difficult to reconcile. And this will be an interesting question for you that I hadn't thought of previously. But I became more gravitated towards people who took a different view, that perhaps the Genesis, written thousands and thousands of years before the scientific explosion or whatever ever even happened, perhaps they weren't actually talking about science back then. It was supposed to be understood differently. Do you view that kind of it is compromising in some sense, but do you view that as something that's tenable, saying, we shouldn't be looking for scientific stuff or literal historical stuff in these very old texts? Do you view Christians who take that view as, in a literal sense, obviously they're taking a compromised view, but do you view that as weak, and why not just go all the way, or how do you view that?
No, I mean, I think that it's at least a more honest position, and it you can harmonize it with what we experience in reality. I mean, most Catholics now, they will not take a literal view of Genesis, and they take more of a metaphorical view of it. And I think that, that's the best way to interpret that. And to be quite honest, I might still be a Christian if I had really, been in the apologetics, sort of like if I had known the different ways that Christians, come about their beliefs about the Bible. If I had known all of the different options, I may not have even ventured down the path of that would have led me to being an atheist, because I think that taking the Genesis accounts and all of that not literally and more metaphorically, and not taking what the Bible is teaching as science or historical record, I think that is a very good position to have, and that Christians are perfectly, fine if they do, have, think about the Bible in that way. I think that I don't look down on anybody for holding any particular belief, except for creationism, because of how anti-reality it really is. And so, taking a metaphorical look at the Old Testament, I think that any Christian that does that is holding the most tenable position as far as their faith goes.
Yeah, it was really for me, and like you said if you had something like that, perhaps you wouldn't have gone the route of atheism. I did have something like that, and it did play a major role in leading me to stay in Christianity. I was trying to figure out how to say that, and that was really John Walton's book. Called he's an Old Testament scholar, called The Lost Story of Genesis, which really follows the same interpretive principles that a fundamentalist like Kinham would follow. That is, taking the historical grammatical approach to Scripture, which I think is the only way to approach any text, let alone Scripture, which just basically means you have to take this text in the context of its historical context, as well as its grammatical or linguistic context as well. And doing that, he comes to the conclusion that they're obviously not teaching science, and we shouldn't be taking literal scientific interpretations of the text from that. So that was kind of the work that did pop up in my study that kind of really helped me, because I knew I couldn't take that position any longer. And so I was like, well, where am I going to go from here? And that was, I think that was the most viable option, and that's why I went down it. Is there a reason? So it's one thing to say I no longer believe in the Bible, or that Jesus rose from the dead, or something like that. But what was kind of I keep using the word domino metaphorically here, but what was kind of the thing that convinced you that God doesn't exist? Because obviously Christianity could be false, the Bible could be false, and yet God could still exist. In fact, all the major world religions and all religions could be false, and there could still be something like a deistic God or a theistic God, like the God of the philosophers or something like that. What kept you from going down that route?
Well, I mean, that kind of assumes I didn't go down that route.
Oh, perhaps you did. Yeah, sorry.
Well, because I mean, I don't hold the position that God does not exist. I hold the position that I don't believe in a God, and I don't believe him to exist, which is very different because you're talking about beliefs. There's a lot of conversation and a lot of arguments on to be had online about like what atheism is.
Sure.
And there's the philosophical definition where it has atheism being a hard atheist or a Gnostic atheist, where the person claims that they know that God doesn't exist or that they believe no gods exist. And I don't take that particular position.
Sure.
I classify myself as an agnostic atheist. So I don't know if there is a God or if there isn't a God. There could very well be some kind of deistic God or some kind of definition of God that we really don't know about. If you take the current times, it kind of seems like maybe Cthulhu is the God of the world. But then you take the atheism part, and that's belief. So that was agnostic, and so the belief part is atheism. That would be that I don't believe in a God, because theism is a belief in a deity, and I lack that belief, or I don't believe in a deity. And so what convinced me, I guess, that what convinced me to not believe in a deity is the lack of good supporting evidence to suggest that there actually is a deity. That doesn't rule out that a deity could exist. There still could be a deity up there, but if there is one up there, then I really don't think that he has any kind of hand in reality. He or she, whatever they pronoun you want to use for them. I don't think that they have any kind of hand in reality. I don't think that they're personal. I don't think that they really care about this one particular universe that they created, if that were the case. But I think that it's more likely that a deity such as that doesn't exist because we don't have any evidence to suggest that that's actually the case.
Okay. Yeah, and you're correct that there would be plenty of debates over the definition of atheism. It's just something I've never. I mean, to some extent, I understand it, but a lot of times I'm just like, let's move on to something else that doesn't really matter. Speaking to the Christians and the theists out there as well, it's just kind of. But I think the distinction you made would actually solve the problem, which is the way I would solve it too. Is I get it. Okay, we can agree that the term atheism has a philosophical meaning, which means no gods exist. But there's also, you can qualify that in different ways and say, yeah, I don't hold to that position, like you just said. I just don't find the arguments that theists or Christians or Muslims or Jews or whoever put forward, I don't find their arguments convincing. So that God may exist, but it's really an epistemological point, I think, which is if he exists, we either can't know it or I don't have good reason to believe it yet. So I think that's a perfectly consistent and coherent view to hold, which is why I don't ever quibble about it. But then again, a lot of people won't. I don't know about a lot of people. I just made that up as if I've done some statistics. But there are some atheists who will just say, no, that's the incorrect definition of atheism. And it's at that point I'm like, no, that's the correct definition. But if you want to hold to something else, you're welcome to, like you just said. So I like the way you put it, and I think that's perfectly coherent, and that's why I don't quibble about it on the internet with people. I would quibble about it with people if they're trying to, like if I was you and some Christian was trying to say that's inconsistent or something, then I'd be like, what's this? I can defend this position, but I'm just saying me as a Christian or as a theist, I don't quibble about it with atheists because it doesn't really matter to me. But a lot of things don't matter to me that matter to me. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say a lot of times from both Christians and atheists, I get that like, oh, well, you're not an atheist then. You're an agnostic. And agnostic has become a word to mean that you don't know whether or not a God exists and you don't know what you believe. And I'm perfectly fine if people want to say that they're an agnostic. I'm not sitting here trying to say that particular position doesn't exist. I think that the pure agnostic sort of position can exist, but I prefer. I like the organization of having agnostic and then atheist, because you can be both. You can not know whether or not a God exists, but you choose not to believe in one.
Okay.
I feel like the belief part and the knowledge claim should be separate, but I don't want anybody out there to think that I don't consider agnosticism to be a real position. I'm just saying that for me, I can be agnostic and atheist at the same time.
Gotcha.
Defining it the way that I did.
Yeah, I'm having a thought experiment in my head, like what I would do, and that would be if came to the conclusion that Christianity was false, then I don't know, what would the step be for me? I might be a Jew, probably not. I probably would then just be a classical theist, and then a deist, and then an agnostic, and then I don't know what would make me accept the proposition God does not exist. So I probably would never be an atheist in the hard sense.
Well, yeah. So I agree that, well, for me at least, I consider the positions of 100% God does exist and 100% God does not exist to be equally tenable. So like, I don't think that you could prove 100% that God does exist, but I also don't think that you can 100% prove that God doesn't exist.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I guess I agree with that. That's good enough for me. It's good enough for me. Not again. I pick my battles. I don't choose to quibble about things. And you're probably correct. Now, that's been a good discussion, kind of a long discussion we've had there, and we haven't even come to the reason that we became acquainted with one another in the first place, which was the subject of Jesus Mythosism.
Right.
And rather than me explain it, let me hand it over to you. Explain to the audience what Jesus Mythosism is and perhaps what it's not.
Okay. Well, Jesus Mythicism is kind of a wide category because of its past. In the past, Jesus Mythicism hasn't really had a lot of scholarship behind it, and there's been a lot of crank theories run amok out there. I've got a list somewhere around here of people that just have horrible, like, mythicist positions, and I really do just disregard anything that doesn't have some kind of scholarship to back it up, which I know that many of you out there are like, there's no scholarship to back it up at all. But
there are scholars, yes.
Yeah. So modern Jesus Mythicism, though, is very much backed by scholarship. It's the position that Jesus never actually walked the earth and that he was a mythical figure from the start, and that the evidence that we have most likely points to that particular conclusion. It doesn't rule out that he could exist or anything like that. I think that there's a small chance that he could have existed. Like I think I know Richard Carrier gives it about a 33% chance. Regardless, though, I think that the majority of the evidence points towards him not existing, but there is definitely a chance that he could have existed. And I think that that's really, like, that particular split right there is kind of the most tenable position, being agnostic on whether or not he did exist. I'm just more convinced that he probably didn't. And so that's why I started off always saying, like, Jesus didn't exist, or, something like that, something really kind of hardline. But really, the mythicist position, the most tenable mythicist position, says that Jesus probably didn't exist. And that's just due to the subjective nature of history. When we look at historical evidence, you'll find a lot of opinions and a lot of subjectiveness that's worked into it. And that's what makes doing history hard. But just when it comes down to it, Jesus Mythicism, the most probable position is that Jesus didn't walk the earth, that he was a mythological character from the start.
Okay, thank you. So it seems to me, at least from what I gather from your own videos that you've made, Richard Carrier, Robert Price, the other scholars that you've referred to, Fitzgerald and others, that a lot of the weight or the anchors or something like that, horrible at metaphors, the main thing that mythicism rests on is, at least in large part, one, that the Gospels are not adequate attestation to Jesus's historical existence, and two, that Paul does not attest to a historical Jesus. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with both of those positions.
Yeah. So when it comes to the Gospels, um, what sources do you think lie behind the Synoptic Gospels? So I'm thinking of the Synoptic Problem. Are you familiar with that term?
Yeah.
Okay, I figured you were. You seem like someone who's read up on it, but and perhaps I'll give you then the opportunity to explain what that is for the audience, the synoptic problem, and kind of how do you solve it. And so I'm basically getting at. So I'm thinking about in terms of historical attestation that Jesus did exist. And of course, you've already done a critique of my videos where I laid out a number of sources within the Gospels that are attesting to this, and I think I said like 4 or 5, and I really drew those numbers from Bart Ehrman's work, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But how many sources do you see there? How do you solve that problem? I guess I'll just leave it open like that.
Okay, so you're wondering like if from my point of view,
Yeah.
how were the Gospels written if there wasn't a person that did all the things, right?
Maybe I'll just go ahead and go work from there, and I can ask more specific questions if I need to, I suppose.
Okay. Well, so in my view, and I would say the majority of scholarship's view on the Gospels has Mark being written first in the 70s, and then you've got Matthew being written shortly after that, in about 80s to mid 80s, and then you got Luke being written somewhere in the 90s, most likely after 93, if I'm not mistaken, and then John is most likely written in the 2nd century, and so what we have there is with our earliest source, Mark, that would be where you would want to look for your best evidence. And Mark doesn't name his sources or anything like that, so we don't know what kind of sources he could have been using. Most likely he did have some kind of oral source, but we don't know like where that oral source got their information from. We definitely know that Mark's author was reading Paul's writing, because there's a lot of Paul that's worked into Mark's writing. And then there's also the curious case of Jesus ben Ananias, who has a pretty similar skeletal structure to his life that's contained in Josephus, and it matches up with Mark and the progression of Jesus, not prior to him entering into Jerusalem, but as far as his passion and everything like that, the Jesus ben Ananias story matches up on several points, not just like 1 or 2, but I think it's about 22 different points that connect between Jesus ben Ananias and the Jesus of Mark's gospel. And then of course both Matthew and Luke copy off Mark, and then John read all 3 of them and did his own thing. And so that's how I think the Gospels came to be, but I also think that that's why they're not really all that reliable, because we don't have any idea who the source or who they reference. In fact, Mark only references the scriptures in his writing, and so there's nothing to tie the Gospel of Mark to any eyewitness testimony here on earth. Mm-hmm. So for me at least, that's why I don't consider the Gospels, the Synoptics, to really be all that reliable.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's helpful, and I have some follow-up questions if that's all right with you.
That's fine.
It's going to be, okay, do you agree that Mark's Gospel does present the figure of Jesus as a historical person?
See, it kind of depends on how you look at it, because Mark's Gospel starts off with Jesus being dunked in the water by John the Baptist, right? Mm-hmm. That's where his story starts. And in that, and this is backed up in the scholarship, and I know I've got papers around here if you're interested in it, if you haven't heard of this yet. Sure. But Mark's Gospel is actually an adoptionist view of the Messiah figure. So when Jesus is dunked in the water and baptized by John the Baptist, he comes out, the heavens part, and then the pre-existent archangel that's known as the Messiah inhabits Jesus's body, and then basically walks around, does Jesus things. When he dies on the cross, he dies, and the Messiah spirit or archangel then ascends back up into heaven to take a seat at the right hand of the Father, right? And This is congruent with what we see in Philo's work that was written, right around the same time as Paul, having this messianic pre-existent archangel figure. And you also see a lot of the pre-existent archangel stuff all throughout the other gospels, especially in John, in the very first book, or first chapter, first line, first chapter, where it talks about Jesus being a pre-existent figure that existed alongside God at the creation of the universe. So when you look at Mark's gospel, you have to understand at the time when the author of Mark was writing, he was writing about the Messiah figure that was already pre-existent in heaven, descending and inhabiting the body of a common person, Jesus, and then doing the Jesus things, and then not resurrecting, but dying on the cross, ascending, after that, and then being resurrected from the dead. Even though there's no, in the original ending of Mark, there's no like post-resurrection appearances. You just have the women running away from the tomb, but it just shows that he's been resurrected.
Yeah. And so just mentioning that the end of Mark's gospel, you also don't see anything about Jesus, the historical figure, or the incarnated archangel ascending back into heaven either, do you?
Well, no. I mean, when the women find the tomb, the thing's already rolled away. The tomb's just empty, and I want to say that there's an angel there that tells them go and tell nobody, or go and tell the disciples, but the women run away telling nobody. So there's no like Jesus, turning into an angel and like, ascending into heaven. I guess it's just kind of assumed, since, Jesus talks about how he's going to be seated at the right hand of the Father and stuff like that.
Okay. Okay. Well, then that would be a major disagreement. That would be hard to go from there. But let's go ahead and do this anyway. So you have Mark, and then you said Matthew and Luke copy Mark. How much of Mark do Matthew and Luke copy?
Well, I can't remember the exact percentages.
No, it's okay.
I know.
No, I wouldn't expect you to. That's okay. I mean, like, I wouldn't have an exact percentage either. I'm saying that's okay.
Okay. So Matthew copies most of Mark, and then Luke copies a good portion of Mark. I think it's like over 75%. I know Matthew's probably somewhere around the 90% mark, maybe. Yeah. But also Luke is copying from Matthew, which I know is kind of contentious with some apologists out there, but there's good evidence to show that Luke was copying from both Mark and Matthew in order to generate his gospel.
Yeah. Well, I agree that apologists might have contention with the Luke borrowing from Matthew, but the reason that they might have a contention with that is because a lot of scholars believe that Luke and Matthew are independent, and that's where the Q source comes into play. Now, like you pointed out in your video, even an evangelical scholar like Mark Goodacre is arguing for the non-existence of Q. And I agree that he makes a good case, but it is the case that many, or perhaps even most, New Testament scholars themselves do believe in the existence of Q. But just point out that it's not just apologists, is all I'm saying. But
okay, well, I was going to ask, does that make it more likely to be true?
What make what more likely to be true? Sorry, I missed it.
Well, like, let's just say that most, just for the sake of argument, let's just say most scholars agree that Q exists. Does that most likely mean that it doesn't exist?
Oh, no, of course not. I was just pointing out your wording was, I know many apologists would like to say that that Luke did not copy Matthew, and I was just saying, well, it's not just apologists, it's New Testament scholars as well. So I wasn't saying apologists should use this argument that, well, most New Testament scholars think it, so therefore it's true. I don't think you should argue that way, no. I was just pointing out it's not just apologists, it's also New Testament scholars. But
okay.
But anyway, sorry. But there is material that's found in Matthew, I want to say about 20 to 30%, and a larger portion found in Luke that are not found in Mark at all. So how do you account for, it's called the special material of Mark and Luke, and scholars will use the terms L source and M source for both of those respectively. So the special material in Matthew that's not found in Mark's gospel is called the M source, and the special material found in Luke that's not found in Mark's gospel or in Matthew is called the L source. And so they're not found in Mark, and they're not found in one another. They're completely unique to themselves. Where do you think that material came from?
Well, I mean, so like you said before, with Mark Goodacre and the Q source, and this applies to the L and the M sources or whatnot. I really don't think that it's helpful to just invent sources. I also don't see a compelling argument that would suggest that Luke couldn't have just made stuff up on his own. Like, why does there have to be an L source behind it? Why couldn't have Luke just, made up unique material for his particular gospel? Same thing with Matthew. Why couldn't Matthew just make up, unique material? And then the portions of Matthew that also appear in Luke, it just seems like Luke would have borrowed from Matthew. I don't see any compelling evidence that would suggest that also isn't a explanation. There's nothing that shows that it's that particular series of events didn't happen.
Yeah, I think that's on the table for an explanation. I think this argument works better with the Q source than it does the M source, and I think it works better for the M source than it does the L source. So in other words, I'm saying I think we have the most evidence that the L source is real, and you said that you didn't see any good reason. I'd like to offer one and then see what you have to say to it, not necessarily to debate you on this point, but just to see what you think about it. Which is kind of a debate, but anyway. The L source. So Luke claims to have access to multiple sources in his own gospel, in the prologue to his gospel, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, where he talks about, there's plenty of things that have been written about Jesus beforehand, and he's going to go and investigate it. So he makes the claim, and then even you have said, and I would agree, that Luke did use at least one source, which would be Mark. And then you also believe that Luke used Matthew, so you do believe that he used two sources. So he
sorry, go ahead.
Or just one. Do you think he just used Matthew and the material that's? Go ahead. No, go ahead and clarify.
Okay, well, so Luke, the author of Luke, definitely used a lot of different sources to write his gospel. For one thing, normally when referencing Luke, generally people talk about Luke Acts because the author of Luke definitely wrote Acts.
Okay.
And so he definitely used a lot of sources, but it's not going to be the ones that you're thinking about. Luke used Matthew and used Mark, definitely, because we find content from those in Luke. But Luke also uses Homer, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. He uses Josephus. So, I mean, he does have a lot of different sources that he's pulling from. It's just none of them can be reliably shown to be eyewitness accounts. None of them can be reliably shown to be this L document or anything like that. So really, the L, M, and Q documents are all hypothetical documents, meaning that they don't physically exist.
Right, they're not extant. Yeah.
Right. They don't physically exist now, so there's no way for us to really know, what was in them or even if they existed in the first place. So I guess considering all of the sources that Luke had in order to generate his gospel, it doesn't really seem necessary to invent this other source that he could have potentially pulled from when we don't really have good supporting evidence to say that it existed.
Okay. Do you think that Luke is presenting a historical Jesus? I mean, his prologue seems very much like a bios or a biography or a historiography, that he at least does believe that he's doing his history, that he really is investigating things, and that's how he presents himself. Do you agree with that?
No. Because Luke was obviously written at least after 93. So there's no way that he could have been an eyewitness, and there was no way that he could have had access to eyewitnesses. and we don't know of any actual eyewitness documents. So, I mean, I get how Luke starts out his gospel, but just because he starts it out that way, proclaiming himself, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't he proclaim himself like the best historian or something like that?
I can pull it up real quick if you want, because I can't quote the scriptures from memory.
I can't.
He says, since many have attempted to compile an account concerning the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as those who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word from the beginning passed on to us, it seemed best to me also, because I have followed all things carefully from the beginning, to write them down in orderly sequence for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty concerning the things about which you were taught. So that's Luke's prologue.
Right. I can't remember if he ever says that he's the best historian or whatnot, but in any case, he claims that the eyewitnesses have handed this down, but he doesn't name who these eyewitnesses are. He doesn't name his sources. This thing, I mean, the start of his gospel really doesn't look like the other kind of historical documents that you would find in history. Like, when we talk about, who was it? Alexander the Great. Arian is our best source, and he's 500 years later. There's no way that he had like physical access to the actual eyewitnesses of Alexander the Great. But what he did have extant to him then is for these firsthand eyewitness accounts that he got directly from that he got, directly from whatever kind of library he was. I think he was using some kind of state library or something like that. But in any case, the point is that he had eyewitness accounts, for him, and we know exactly who those eyewitnesses were because he tells us about them, and we just simply don't find that in any of the Gospels. Like, we don't find Luke telling us who these eyewitnesses were, what their names are, what documents they wrote. We know the names of various documents now that we don't have any kind of access to at all, but it's because of how historians wrote at this time that we know some of what those documents contain, but more importantly, their titles, their authors. We don't know who actually wrote the Gospels. They're all anonymous. The very beginning there in Luke does not name the author. The author is not named throughout the entirety of Luke or in Acts. I believe it was Papias in the 2nd century that was the first one to talk about who the authors of these were, with no evidence to support the fact that, or the idea that these are the authors who he says they are. Yeah. So given that, I really don't think that Luke had access to any kind of eyewitnesses because of the point in time that he wrote, and because of the fact that we just simply don't have anybody else referencing an eyewitness to Jesus.
Okay. I was just, first of all, he does name the recipient of his letter as Theophilus. It would be an odd thing to name the recipient and then the recipient not know who the letter was coming from. So I think it's pretty clear that the name would have been attached to this letter. And then, of course, as you were talking about with church tradition passed down, is that it was Luke, and you don't find any contradiction in the church history attestation to Luke being the author of this gospel. But anyway, that would be a separate conversation to have. I think there are good arguments for Luke's, the traditional authorship of Luke. But anyway, I was initially just pointing out that just to take the very first verse in Luke, he says, since many have attempted to compile an account, so this would seem like a written source concerning the events that have been fulfilled among us. And he names his recipient as Theophilus. It seems that Theophilus would know that this was completely bogus if it was just Luke making stuff up. So I think there actually is pretty good indication that he is using written sources to make a compilation, just as he says plenty of other people have already done. And then you also agree that Mark has done this, and that Luke, either directly from Mark or through Matthew, does have access to Mark's source as a source. So I'm just wondering why it would be unrealistic to say that Luke did have other sources about Jesus from that time period.
So like you're asking, why doesn't it make sense that he would have other sources?
Yeah,
Like from that time period,
yeah.
like from eyewitnesses or something?
Not, I mean, they wouldn't even have to be an eyewitness, but just sources that were recording things about Jesus at that time period in the first century.
Well, I mean, he very well could have. I wasn't trying to necessarily suggest that, he didn't have, any other sources that could have talked about Jesus. It's perfectly reasonable that he could have. Which, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. No, my stuff was freaking out there for a second.
You're good. Sorry.
So it's perfectly plausible that he could have had some other sources or whatnot. The problem is that he doesn't name who his sources are. He doesn't name, the only reason why we know that he copied from Mark and Matthew is that because the stuff, sometimes verbatim word usage is found in Luke's gospel. It's the same way that we know that he used, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey in order to generate Paul's shipwreck narratives in Acts. He pulled from those, the style of those. That's why you have those we passages in those areas, because that's how the Iliad and the Odyssey were written. And Josephus, we know that Luke used Josephus because of certain things that Josephus says that are wrong are said in the exact same way and order in Luke's. And that's just one particular example that I can pull off the top of my head. We have these connections, and these are hard connections because we can identify and we can pull, this information from it, and we know that he used these particular sources, but we don't know what he used, outside of those. I mean, it's very plausible that he could have had other sources, but plausible or possible does not mean probable. Well, and yeah. I think that's where a lot of people get kind of confused at, is that they think of a possibility. Oh, it's possible he used some other source. Yeah, it's possible, but we don't really know what that source could have been. It's just inventing sources like the Q source or L source or M source. There's no real point in creating these new sources if you don't have evidence to suggest that those sources were there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I agree with your proposition that possible does not mean probable or plausible. Even though you'd been using the word plausible, which I thought was going to be interesting, but I think you corrected yourself there, so I'm not going to. But I think it is probable that Luke, for sure, by for sure I mean it's for sure probable, that Luke had sources concerning Jesus specifically, because we, as you, again, you believe, and I believe, as everybody does, that he at least used Mark and possibly Matthew and or a Q source, but we'll just say Matthew. So he used Mark and Matthew, or Mark via Matthew. And then he claims that there are more sources available, written about these events being specifically about Jesus, available to him, that Theophilus is aware of as well. And then we can back him up with at least one source, being Mark or possibly Matthew. And so I think there is positive evidence to weigh in favor, so that makes it more probable that there were other sources and he had access to them. And you may not find that convincing, but where I'm just gonna land the plane now, and I'm landing the plane at this. There seems to have been multiple sources, and Luke has access to them, and he in fact is using them to create his narrative about Jesus, and that's the point. They're about Jesus, and so I think you have multiple first century sources about the existence of Jesus. If you may not agree with that assessment, but if you did agree with that assessment, would that change your mind at all on Jesus Mythicism?
No.
Can you explain why?
Well, I mean, it doesn't really handle the timeline in which we know Luke is written, because if memory serves, Luke is supposed to be like the partner of Paul, right?
Yeah, the travel companion of Paul. Yeah.
Right. And so, which I can't remember. I don't think Luke claims to be one of the disciples, does he?
No, Luke's not a disciple of Jesus.
Right. Okay. Just making sure that I had that correct in my head. But you see, the problem is that Luke, whoever the traveling companion of Paul was, wouldn't have been around like in 93, and so there's no way that Luke could have written that particular gospel. So regardless of what kind of sources that the author of Luke could have had, we don't have enough evidence right now to solidly establish that he used like eyewitness accounts or even secondary accounts. That would be people that wrote recording, eyewitness accounts. So I just don't see anything that suggests that is more plausible or probable rather than Luke, the author of Luke just making stuff up and using these various outside sources in order to fill his gospel and Acts with historical color.
Okay, so even if you were to grant the assessment that I laid out there, you're saying even if we granted that Luke was written in 93, which would certainly be up for debate, even if we granted that, you're talking about 60 years after the supposed crucifixion of Jesus, right? And if Luke was using multiple sources about Jesus, again, you're granting what my assessment was there a second ago, then you have within 60 years of his life multiple accounts of his life, and you're saying that still wouldn't be enough?
Well, because this is all just hypothetical.
Sure. Yeah. Purely hypothetical. Granting all those things. Yeah, I'm not saying you would grant those things.
Well, if you could solidly if you could have documents that were actual eyewitness testimony and they were real documents of eyewitness testimony of Jesus on earth, then I would definitely give up like the mythicist position. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that we just simply don't have those. We don't have any indication that those actually exist. We can play hypothetical games all day, but the point of the fact is that Luke doesn't tell us who these eyewitnesses were, what documents he used. We have to go in and we have to sort of play detective and figure out the documents that we know that he used. So while it doesn't rule out the possibility of him using these other documents, I don't think that there's any kind of actual evidence to suggest that he did use these other documents. And for me at least, in just inventing these other documents, it really isn't persuasive.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. I want to move on now. That was an interesting dialogue. Thanks for kind of digressing there and answering all my follow-up questions. I know you weren't prepared for those, but thank you for answering them. I want to move on to Paul, because I think this is kind of the... Oh, are you still there? Oh, I had something pop up on my screen. I thought it was you going away. I was like, oh no, where did John go? He's still here. He's still here.
Screw this.
Yeah, no more follow-up questions. Boom. So moving on to the subject of Paul and his beliefs about Jesus, I think this plays a big part in the Jesus mythicists. I think it really carries the most weight for mythicists, and that's because it was... because Paul is believed to have been with good evidence, to be the earliest Christian writings that we have. Does this play kind of the biggest part for you? Or you know what, I didn't even ask this question going back, but maybe this was what led you into Jesus mythicism in the first place. But I actually would like to ask you that question. What got you into Jesus mythicism in the first place?
Oh, well, so interestingly enough, I was on Facebook and I was arguing with Christians and atheists, and I found myself talking about history and, trying to establish that Jesus existed in history, because I was like, of course he existed in history. What are you talking about? Like, I had the exact same position as everybody that I've come in contact since. But the problem is that I went looking for the evidence to suggest that Jesus existed in history, because I expected there to be some kind of like eyewitness account or something like that, like actual eyewitness account. And what I found was, which I think the discussion was on Pilate, because there's a Pilate stone, and so I mean we know that Pilate existed in history. But when I tried to find solid evidence that Jesus existed in history, I really couldn't find any. I found all of the, the typical arguments that, for instance, like you used in your videos. And I really didn't find those convincing for reasons that I've laid out in multiple videos. But I didn't find those convincing. And so it was really just it's kind of similar to the God question.
Yeah, that's what I was gathering. Yeah.
Yeah, I just didn't find enough evidence to convince me that he actually did exist in history. And, I started just reading a whole bunch of books. I started off with David Fitzgerald's Nailed book.
Yeah.
And that kind of got me dipping my toes in the water about it. And then I started reading, more and more stuff. And, I would always see those memes where they compare like Jesus to Horus, and they would say, hey, he had, 12 disciples and was born on December 25th, just like Jesus. And, I didn't know whether or not that was true or not. But once I started looking more into the history of it, I obviously know now that, of course, Jesus isn't a carbon copy of Horus or any other. He's not a carbon copy of any other deity in history. That's not to say that, he doesn't have some borrowed elements from different dying and rising gods. But, that kind of got me down the road of Jesus Mythicism, was trying to find the evidence and then not being convinced by the evidence.
Yeah. How much weight does the belief that Paul did not believe in historical Jesus? In other words, if it could be shown that Paul did believe in historical Jesus, would that change your mind?
I mean, of course, I've looked at all the evidence in Paul, and I'm not convinced. But
right.
If there was, if I guess hypothetically, if there was some new document that was verified, written by Paul, and he definitely talks about how Jesus walked on earth, and provides like some kind of eyewitness testimony to him walking on earth, then yeah, pretty much any evidence that could solidly and reliably place Jesus in history, that would make me become not a mythicist quick. But the problem is that I've looked at all of the passages in Paul, and I'm simply not convinced by Paul that Jesus actually existed in history.
Yeah. And I suppose you're about to do a video on this, actually, responding to my video on Paul's beliefs about Jesus, and look forward to that. I don't know if I mentioned this passage or not in that video. Is a short video. And that was my first really actually short video. I normally do stuff like this that goes on forever, so I and by that I wasn't critiquing you, I'm critiquing myself. I ramble a lot, and so I was kind of testing out, should I do more shorter videos every once in a while to see, maybe my audience would prefer something short, which, you kind of got to sacrifice some things if you're going to go short. Like I don't get to explain everything as well as I'd like to. So I was really trying that out. I might do some more, I don't know. But anyway, see, I have ADD and I just go off rambling like that. But anyway, in the passage is 1 Corinthians 11:23 through 27, which I'm sure you've come across. I'm just interested to hear your explanation here. And I'll read it, and I don't know if you have a Bible in front of you or not, and so I may put you at a disadvantage here, so I'm sorry. But I'm kind of assuming that you're already familiar and you've already got it worked up in the video you're going to publish here in a few days. But the passage says in 1 Corinthians 11, starting in verse 23, says, this is Paul, for I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you, the Corinthians, that the Lord Jesus, on the night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and after he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Likewise also the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So a lot of people would give that a first glance and just say, Jesus is eating bread, drinking from a cup. He's talking to people. He's talking about his death. He's going to die, insinuating he's going to die. This all sounds very human. How do you interpret this text as not referring to a human historical Jesus?
Well, I mean, he doesn't say he's going to die.
Doesn't say
he says, for whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so, this is probably Paul talking. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, no. Okay. So my contention with this particular thing, and you do mention it in the video that I'm preparing. Well, I've already prepared. I just got to record it. It's that first line there. For I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. So let me ask you this question. Where did Paul get this information?
It's a good question, and it is one that's debated in scholarship, which is Paul claiming this to be a divine revelation, or is this apostolic sources that he has in mind here that he received it from? And so this is something that I would definitely need to study on. He does elsewhere in 1 Thessalonians. I was going to pull it up, but I'm not going to be able to pull that up quick enough. He does in 1 Thessalonians talk about how the Thessalonians received from Paul God's word. And so something Paul commonly does is talk about him preaching, but it being God's word, or them receiving God's word, even though he's the one that's clearly saying it. And so he doesn't really draw this hard and fast line between the gospel being from human people and being a divine revelation. He kind of fuses the two together. He certainly does it in the 1 Thessalonians passage I have in mind, but I think he does it elsewhere. But anyway, that's just to say, not to make the case that it's certainly not divine revelation. That's just to say that kind of makes it difficult to decide whenever you look at these things, is that Paul doesn't make a hard... Go ahead.
Well, I was just it's very curious that you say, you when you said, because let me make sure that I get this right.
Sure.
You're saying that Paul got his information from other people?
Oh, I'm saying this is the debate. I'm not picking a side. I'm trying to set this up for the audience, or for you, or for me, whoever. I'm saying Paul, at least in 1 Thessalonians, and I wish and if I don't want to waste my time trying to find it. It would be a long pause here. But in 1 Thessalonians, at least, I was just reading this. I know about this verse because I just happened to be reading it in my quiet time the other day. Paul is saying that clearly he's the one that has preached the gospel to the Thessalonians, and yet they received it as God's word. And so I'm saying he doesn't necessarily draw a hard and fast line between divine revelation and words being spoken by human beings. And so that kind of makes it difficult or at least that makes it possible kind of either way. We got to look at these things. He doesn't use a Greek participle here in the 1 Corinthians passage that he uses elsewhere when he's clear, like the Galatians passage where he's clearly talking about divine revelation. And so there's some concerns on both sides here. Is he making a divine revelation? Is he passing on information that he got from Cephas or James or somebody else or a different apostle? It's up for debate, and I don't necessarily I'm not necessarily choosing sides at this point.
Okay. Well, so I'm not convinced at all that he got it from, anybody, like on earth. My primary evidence for that is actually Galatians 1:11, which is and I'm reading from the ESV version. Paul, let's see. For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. So for me, whenever I read passages like 1 Corinthians 11:23, I try to take Paul's theology in general into context here, because Paul was writing in about a 10-year time span between 50 and 60. And so, I mean, by the time that he's writing all of this down, I mean, he's already got his theology well established. And so right here, when I read, for I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you, and even in the Thessalonians thing, Jesus appears to the apostles in visions, gives them the information, and then the apostles are the ones that disseminate the information on behalf of Jesus. So when he talks right here about the last meal or last supper, his source, his citation is his vision of Jesus. Jesus is the one that told him about this. Jesus is the one that is talking about how he died, because Paul never knew Jesus while he was alive. He only knew about Jesus after he died and resurrected. So when he's talking about this, this is a replacement for the, like the Passover meal, it's the way that people re-up their commitment, basically, to Jesus. And that's why he says, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes,
right?
Because it's foretelling that Jesus is going to be returning. And so basically in this passage, I don't feel like it actually gives us any kind of indication of like a historical nature of it, because of the fact that the source is totally devoid of any connection to a human source, at all. It's only the only connection, the only citation that Paul uses are scriptures and visions of Jesus. So the best that you could talk about is how Paul got this from maybe the scriptures. Maybe Paul didn't receive it in a vision, but that Jesus somehow guided him in his understanding of the scriptures, which is how he gets some of the theology that he teaches. He gets it from scriptures. So, I mean, that's how I would take that verse.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm happy to see that Paul is claiming to have received this as a divine revelation. That's perfectly fine. And the reason I'm willing to do that is because of something actually that you said yourself, and I don't want to try to misrepresent you or trap you in your own words. So perhaps after I say this, you can rehash things if you want to, or you might agree with my assessment there. But you said that Paul did not know Jesus until after Jesus' death and resurrection. And the reason I think that's significant is because I think the key to this passage is actually there where he says, for I received from the Lord, and we can interpret that as a divine revelation, though I think it is up for debate, what I also passed on to you. So Paul has passed this on to the Corinthians, that the Lord Jesus, on the night in which he was betrayed. Richard Carrier would say that this should be a better translation would be on the night in which he was delivered up, and Carrier himself says this is obviously talking about the night in which he died. Now you just said that, and I would agree, I think everyone would agree, that Paul did not know Jesus until after his death and after his resurrection. And so what follows here about the bread and about the cup and the eating and the things like that, this all happened on the night in which he was betrayed, which obviously Paul was not present on that night, because as you said, Paul did not know Jesus until after his death and resurrection. And obviously, and so what that means is here where he says, this is my body which is for you, these words Jesus spoke on the night in which he was betrayed, which Paul clearly wasn't present on that night. And so Jesus' words here are clearly not directed at Paul, because Paul wasn't present on the night in which Jesus was delivered up or betrayed, and neither were the Corinthians. Or I think Carrier tries to say that this you here, and he's correct in saying that it is a plural form. It would be like saying y'all, this is for y'all. It is clearly not for all believers everywhere. It's just making some general theological point that I'm dying for everyone, which is obviously true, but not everyone was present on the night in which Jesus was betrayed. So I think the question is, who's he talking to?
Well, I mean, I feel like, Paul is talking about, what Jesus told him. And so this is talking, it's Jesus talking to, Paul. So when he says the you part here, I mean, he would be talking to like Paul, but in reality, I feel like he's setting up like the Christian tradition. Like he's establishing, instead of like the Passover meal and all of these other things, he's setting up and he's talking to general like Christians. Mm-hmm. So I think that would be more likely than some kind of like hidden historical citation that could be hidden in that.
So I agree with the assessment, and this is exactly the assessment that Carrier makes. Not trying to say that you're like some Richard Carrier copycat or whatever. This is a common thing that mythicists hold in common, and you can perfectly come to that of your own accord, obviously. So I'm not trying to say that, but I'm just saying that I've read Carrier's work on this, and this is the route that he goes. He's saying that Jesus here is saying, this is my body, which is for you, Paul, and the Corinthians, and by way all believers. That the theology of that is obviously true, and obviously something that Paul believes. In fact, I'd say that he doesn't just think it's for all believers, which is what Carrier says. I think that Jesus died for everyone. Not a universalist, but I'm saying it's available for everyone to accept. However, I think that these words are originally spoken, as Paul, I think, very explicitly and clearly says, on the night in which he was betrayed. So while these words may apply to everyone, Paul and the Corinthians, and I would say me and you, because I believe Jesus died for everyone, these words obviously apply to everyone. They were originally spoken on the night in which he was betrayed, which neither you, me, all believers everywhere, Paul, or the Corinthians were present. So I agree with what you're saying. I'm just saying Paul, I think, clearly believes that these words were initially or originally spoken on the night in which Jesus was betrayed or delivered up.
Well, yeah, but we don't really have any good evidence to suggest that is the exact case, because of the fact that Paul is totally devoid. Like it would be theologically antithetical for Paul to use information that he got from human sources.
No, I'm saying he got this from Jesus. I would grant that.
Oh, okay. Well, then that right there is where we would deviate, I guess, is because I really don't think that, a hallucination of Jesus or a vision of Jesus is good historical data.
Oh, no. I'm not saying that it really happened. I'm saying that's what Paul is claiming.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to grant that point to you. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought that you were trying to suggest that this was an indication that he actually existed.
No. I'm saying Paul believes. Look, I was trying to. So the verse 23 says, "For I received from the Lord." I'm trying to grant to you that the correct interpretation is that Paul believes this to have been divine revelation.
Okay.
And so whether he received this from Jesus or from an apostolic source is neither here nor there to me. That's why I was willing to grant that to you.
Okay, maybe I just misunderstood.
No, that's okay. I'm just saying that whether he really received it from Jesus or got it from somebody else or made it up, that's fine. I'm just saying this is what he believes. Not necessarily true. This is just what Paul believes, that on the night in which Jesus was delivered, these things occurred. And then I'm saying, according to Paul himself and you, he was not present on that night, and neither were the Corinthians or all believers everywhere. So he's talking to somebody else initially.
Well, no, I mean, well, if this is given, if this is information from a vision that was given to Paul, then, I mean, in this dialogue, he would be talking to Paul, but also in the grander scheme, he would be talking to, like, everybody that would consider Jesus to be the Savior, regardless of whether or not Jesus died for everybody. Whoever considers Jesus to be the Savior and believes in Jesus, he is conveying that this is the ritual that you do.
Right.
So, I mean, that's how I interpret it.
No, I interpret it that way too. I'm agreeing with that. Right. So whenever we could say that this was that Paul believes this to be a revelation from Jesus, and Jesus here is teaching the theology that his body and his blood is for all who see him as the Savior, like you were saying. I think that Paul's own words indicate that that's not who these words were originally or initially spoken to, considering the fact that these words, Paul himself says, were first spoken on the night in which he was delivered up. And Paul was not present on that night, and neither were everyone who sees Jesus as the Savior, and neither were the Corinthian believers. So clearly Jesus is speaking to somebody else initially. Does that make sense?
I mean, I see where you're coming from. I just disagree.
Okay, that's fine. We can move on from there. Thanks again for digressing and entertaining my follow-up questions, of course. And again, I look forward to the video you're going to put out here in a couple of days, and I think everybody else should go watch it as well. One last question before we get to the bonus segment. We've gone on for quite a while here. This has been, I'll just go ahead and say, this has been one of my favorite conversations to have. Thanks so much, John. Or do you prefer being called John, or should I call you Godless Engineer, or kind of which one do you prefer?
Well, yeah, it doesn't really matter to me.
Yeah, well, I just really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. I'm sure you got a lot going on, of course, with the coronavirus and everything. You are kind of, as we all are, stuck at home. But I do appreciate you coming on. To the audience, thanks so much for listening. If you want to watch the bonus segment, 5 more minutes with Godless Engineer, which you should want to watch, just follow the Patreon link in the description below and become a patron supporter. Here in a minute, we're going to do the 5 more minute bonus segment. And with that subscription over there on Patreon, you'll not only get access to this bonus segment, but all of our previous bonus segments, as well as all of our future bonus segments. So go over there and become a supporter. I really appreciate all the patron supporters, all 10 or 12 of you. Thanks so much. So one last question before we do that. Now, in your initial videos, I must say there's kind of, and I don't want to cause any hostility here, but I do want to say there's kind of a contrast between the Godless Engineer of those videos and the Godless Engineer sitting here having a conversation with me. As I'm sure there's a contrast between my original video on Jesus Mythicism and Haden Clark that you're having a conversation with here right now. But there was kind of some hostile remarks. You said that I was the most biased Christian ever. My question is, does the fact that someone is biased make their beliefs false?
Well, no, I wouldn't say that just because they're biased, it was false, which I don't remember calling you the most biased Christian ever. If I did, then, I'll walk that back. Maybe I was just trying to be bombastic or something.
Sure. And I understand that in the land of YouTube, your audience wants entertainment value as well as mine. I'm not saying it's just atheists. Christian audiences want entertainment value too. So I'm not saying that I take offense to any of that. I was just, but go ahead.
But yeah, I mean, we all do have biases. I just feel like on the religious faith part, I feel like bias has to be a major factor in it. Because I mean, your faith kind of, like, for instance, your faith kind of requires that you believe that Jesus resurrected from the dead, right?
For me to be a Christian, I would have to believe that, yes.
Yeah.
But I can say that in order to be an agnostic atheist, you have to believe that God most probably does not exist.
Well, I mean, I guess so, in order to classify yourself, but also I don't feel like on that particular one there's a very big, like, I don't see that as a faith-based position. Like, that's necessary for the label, but it's not like a faith-based position. I feel like faith has a very strong emotional, like, I guess, connection, to.
Oh, you want me to, sorry. I'm not trying to interrupt you. I see what you're saying, and I think whenever you say, let's see if we can agree on this. Whenever you say there's this faith connection and this faith element that weighs heavy, I think what you mean is what you've already described in yourself whenever you saw the counter evidence to your faith and you're like, but everybody around me is a Christian and that sort of stuff. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I mean, I guess kind of. That was when I was struggling with my faith. But I feel like most Christians, are tied to their faith. Obviously, they're very emotionally connected to their faith, and you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure, go ahead. No, fine, go.
Okay. I mean, I understand that your faith concerns your eternal soul, like afterlife. And I really don't think that people should take that lightly. And I don't expect people to take it lightly. So when somebody has a faith-based position that seems to require them to believe in certain, from my point of view, fantastical things, it seems to me like a lot of people find ways to maneuver around the evidence in order to keep their faith because they're emotionally attached.
Yeah. No, I agree with that 100%. I agree that people do that. I mean, I would want to present this scenario though. Let's, and you can help me make this scenario, make a game of it. We can create the most biased Christian ever, which is someone who was, born in the church. They were dunked at an early age. They've been taught 6-day creationism from literal interpretation of Genesis. Non-believers are going to burn in hell forever. I mean, the most fundamentalist beliefs that you can possibly imagine. They've never studied apologetics. They have no. They're a presuppositionalist. What else might we add?
I don't know, just a general strict adherence to the Bible.
Yeah, like they're just the most biased person ever. You and I would agree that that's poor methodology. But we'd still have to argue against them on the basis of evidence and reason. Because just saying, you're biased, you're probably wrong. Clearly they're biased, but it's obviously still possible that they're correct.
I mean, it is possible. And I never mean to suggest that just because somebody is biased or they have a bias, that means that they're wrong.
Okay.
What my point was, and still is that the person with the biased position potentially has a reason to illogically hold that position.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah.
So, the point in pointing out like the bias is that because that person is biased because of their faith, that is not like like just because they hold a position or they think a certain thing or they argue some kind of bad evidence, it just doesn't it's not convincing to me. So like for instance, when I hear an apologist start to talk about history of Jesus, if they say something that I haven't heard before, I'm immediately skeptical of what they say.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think that's a healthy kind of skepticism.
I would agree.
Because,
yeah.
So that's all that I'm trying to say here.
Yeah,
is that like the apologists and even New Testament scholars, they definitely have a very strong bias because of their faith-based positions. Not all New Testament scholars are, Christian, of course, but I mean, I would say that most New Testament scholars are indeed Christian, which kind of seems like if someone's going to say, well, most New Testament scholars agree Jesus existed. It's like, but did he really though? Like, I mean, what's the actual evidence behind it? And not like a knock against you or anything, but
sure.
I mean, a lot of people out there just say, well, mainstream scholarship disagrees with you. And I'm like, well, I mean, I'm already I'm already disagreeing with mainstream scholarship.
Yeah.
I get that I'm doing that. I get that it's on me to prove mainstream scholarship wrong.
Sure.
Right. I get that.
Well, I just to be honest, I actually admire it. This is why I admire people who, but then again, so this is actually interesting because you kind of get a double-edged sword. You're holding to a position that's obviously not mainstream scholarship, and willing to debate it. And when you're presented with reasons why mainstream scholarship believes what they believe, you refute it, and things like that. And I actually see a parallel here between other. So I mean, all you have to do is say what other positions are like that, and another position that you find like that is the creationist non-evolution interpretation of science and things like that. It's like they're holding to a position that's clearly not mainstream scholarship, and they're holding to it very strongly. And when presented with and there's probably obvious breaks in the analogy. I'm just highlighting the analogy. And they're holding to it in the face of arguments made by the mainstream side. And so I think there's something admirable about that. I think, hey, you're convinced, and the fact that the overwhelming majority, or the majority of scholars disagree with you, and you're continuing to hold to it, I think there's obviously something admirable in that. It's almost like, it's almost like Remember the Alamo. You're just going to take your stand. And because until you're convinced otherwise. I'm not saying you're taking a religious stand on Jesus Mythos Ism, and that would be a point where the analogy breaks down. But I'm just saying there is something admirable about that, both in you and for me. I'm just saying there's something admirable about that with the creationists. And yet there's that double-edged sword of bias that I think comes into both of those accounts.
Well, see, a little bit of advice, at least for me, don't ever compare mythicism to creationism. I get that it's the same in that we're both challenging the consensus, but there's a very, very big difference here. For one thing, minimal mythicism, which is the position that I hold, is scholarly based. Has a growing number of scholars in the field that are taking a look at the evidence and not coming out convinced that he existed. You got Raphael Lataster, he's agnostic about it. You've got several other people that are learned, that have the appropriate degrees and appropriate experience in the field, that aren't convinced by that Jesus actually existed. Now, where Jesus mythicism and creationism really differ is that his historiography is very subjective. If you read, you can read any number of New Testament scholars, they'll have different opinions on these different things, and it's all subjective opinions. And what you have to do is you got to look at the evidence and see which side has more support with actual evidence versus like made up evidence like Q. Where this differs from creationism deals with hard science. These are things that we can actually test and prove to be either correct or incorrect. With history, it's soft. You don't have verified proof of these things. What you do is you find the most likely answer, and that's inherently subjective. It's inherently based on probability. What do you think is the most probable answer? And so the difference here is very stark. It's like night and day, because creationism denies hard science, denies all the evidence that we have, hard evidence that directly points to like an old earth, that points to the Big Bang and all this. They deny all of that in favor of a book that's, inherently faith-based, that was written by people that didn't understand astronomy or cosmology or any kind of advanced science. And they're saying that is more accurate than the hard science that we can use now that we can test reality with, whereas historiography is not that way at all.
Yeah, no, I'm perfectly happy to relent that point. I was not really trying to make a substantive point about that, just trying to talk about going against the grain or going against the mainstream scholarship, or however you want to word that. Perhaps I picked the wrong analogy there. It was just something that had been discussed throughout the conversation, is why it was on my mind. Did you have something else? Sorry.
No, I mean, I was gonna say, like I didn't take offense from it or anything.
No,
like that
I didn't gather
you.
that. Yeah.
Okay. But I mean, like, you could make the exact same analogy between somebody who thinks that the Gospels, which I'm not sure if you think this, but somebody that thinks the Gospels were written right around the same time that Paul was writing, that they were written by eyewitnesses. That position is comparable to creationism in the same way that like mythicism is comparable to creationism. So, I mean, it's really not a helpful thing to like trying to compare it. I get the fact that you were trying to say that it's admirable to sort of take on the consensus, but I guess I just do think that creationism is probably the wrong way. A good analogy I would say would be like the scholarship and the scholars that were contending that Moses and Noah and how we know the Israelites became a nation. That entire discussion is very similar to the Jesus mythicism, because in that position, like, I don't think that Moses was a historical person or Abraham or any of them, and that is the mainstream consensus position. But a lot of apologists out there and even some scholars take the position that it was that they were actually real people.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's a better comparison.
Yeah, it's kind of a flip flop. On the one side, it's people arguing this person did not exist, and on the other side, it's people arguing no, these people did exist. So that's an interesting analogy there. Well, again, thanks so much for joining me, John, and to the audience. Again, if you want to watch the 5 more minute bonus segment with Godless Engineer, be sure to follow the Patreon link in the description below and become a supporter of the show. John, thanks so much for joining me, sir. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. I had a great time. I mean, conversations like this pass by really quick, and I get rambly too, so I understand.